The little dragon said 3 words to me before I said anything at all to him. "I'm lost," he said. He was standing at the bottom of the loading dock stairs in the rain, which was the cold kind of rain we get at Carrathway Station in the late weeks of the long season, horizontal, tasting of iron, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck no matter how many times you button up. He was standing in it without flinching, which told me something about how long he had already been wet. His scales were a deep dark green, almost black where the rain had soaked them through, and they lay close to his body the way a bird's feathers do in a downpour, flat and miserable. He was small. The top of his head came to about my sternum, which, on me, is not a very imposing height. He had a pair of short horns curving back from his brow, still rounded at the tips the way young horn growth is, not yet hardened to the blunt points the adults carry. His tail was wrapped tight around his own ankles, which I later came to understand was something he did when he was frightened. His eyes were gold amber, large for his face, and they were fixed on me with an expression I recognized in the way you recognize something you have no good word for, not quite asking, not quite demanding, not quite pleading. All 3, maybe, compressed into 2 amber circles under a curtain of rain. I had come out to check the dock delivery schedule, because the morning freighter from Vell Station was running 40 minutes late, and I needed to know whether to hold the lunch prep or start it. I had a clipboard in one hand and a mug of yesterday's tea in the other, and I was wearing my green apron with the bleach spot on the left hip that I have never managed to lift. I was not, in other words, prepared for a small lost dragon to be standing at the bottom of my loading stairs. I looked at him, he looked at me. I said, "All right, coming out of the rain then, because what else do you say?" His name, I found out a week later, was Velthan. I didn't know it for the first week because for the first week he didn't tell me, and I didn't push. He had said he was lost and he had come inside when I asked him to, and for a day or 2 that felt like enough of a transaction. Names could wait. What I knew about Carrathway Station when I arrived there 7 years ago was this. It sat at the edge of what the freight manifests called the Corvith Reach, which was a region of space the dragons administered, and which most of our cargo only skirted, hauling ore and grain and fabricated parts for the smaller frontier settlements that clustered along the border. The station itself was a working freight stop, not a diplomatic hub. It had a landing strip, a fuel depot, a small repair yard, and a canteen which was mine to run anyway. 3 tables inside, 4 stools at the counter, a kitchen behind a half wall, and a back room where I kept the dry stores and when the freight ran early did my ordering. No frills. The clientele was mostly freighter crews, maintenance teams from the repair yard, and the occasional long-haul traveler who wanted something other than a packaged ration. I made soup and sandwiches and a rice dish with dried vegetables that was better than it had any right to be, and I opened at 6 in the morning and closed when the last table left, which was usually by 8 at night. It was a quiet life. I had worked noisier jobs and I preferred the quiet. The back room had a folding cot that I kept set up for the rare nights when weather grounded me at the station. And that first night I made it up with a spare blanket and put a water bowl and a plate of whatever I had left from the day's prep on the floor beside it. And I showed it to the child and said, "You can sleep here tonight." He looked at the cot and at the bowl and at me, and then he curled up on the floor next to the cot rather than on it, which was his preference, I came to understand, for the whole 11 days. Floor creatures, young dragons. They liked the solid thing beneath them. He was so small curled up that way that the blanket I put over him reached past the tip of his tail and pooled on the floor on the far side, and I had to tuck it back up so he would not pull it loose in the night. I went back to the kitchen and finished the closing down, and I turned the lights to the low overnight setting, and I stood in the doorway of the back room for a moment to make sure his breathing had settled. It had. Deep and even and slow, the breathing of a creature that was, against some odds, finally warm. In the morning he was still there, which I had half wondered about, and I fed him again and went about opening up the canteen. He sat on the floor in the kitchen doorway and watched me work. He didn't speak much that first day, and I didn't press him. I talked to myself when I cooked, the way I always had, narrating the steps not because I needed to, but because silence in a kitchen feels wrong to me. You say, "All right, the stock goes in now." And that wants another 10 minutes, and there's the freighter, right on time today. And after a while he seemed to settle into the sound of it the way you settle into weather that turns out to be warmer than you expected. His horns, I noticed on day 2, had a faint pattern of lighter scaling along the ridge where they joined the skull. I didn't know enough about draconic anatomy to know whether that was normal or unusual. It caught the light differently at different angles, a subtle thing, the kind of detail you only noticed if you were paying the kind of attention that close quarters in a small kitchen naturally produce. I filed it away without attaching any particular significance to it, the way you file the small details of someone who has moved into your peripheral space and become, without ceremony, a part of your daily visual field. On day 2, he also watched me reline the warming shelf, which involves getting up on the step stool and reaching into the back left corner with a cloth, and he watched this with total concentration, the gold-amber eyes following the operation from start to finish as if it contained information he intended to retain. When I climbed back down, he said, "The corner is difficult." "It always is," I said. "You should have a longer cloth," he said. I looked at him. He met my eyes without self-consciousness, as if the suggestion was obvious and he saw no reason to be uncertain about it. "I should have a longer cloth," I agreed. "I keep meaning to cut one." "I could hold the step stool," he offered, "so it doesn't move." "That would help," I said. He held the step stool for the rest of the week whenever I needed it. He was good at it. He planted himself and didn't shift, and he was heavy enough at the base that the stool genuinely didn't move. It was a practical contribution, honestly rendered, and I accepted it as such. By day 3 he was eating properly, not the hesitant nibbling of the first day, when he had approached each plate as if uncertain whether he was permitted to have it, but real eating, the appetite of a young creature making up for lost meals. He liked the rice dish best. He would sit and finish it and then look at the empty plate for a moment and then look at me, and I would say, "There's more," or "That's the last of it, sorry," and he seemed to understand me perfectly well both ways. The freighter crews who came through on day 3 were a group of 4 I recognized, regulars on the Vel station loop. Good people. No trouble, decent tippers. They glanced at the child in the kitchen doorway with the mild curiosity of people who have seen enough strange things in their working lives that a small dragon sitting quietly in a canteen kitchen registers as unusual but not alarming. The one called Finn, who was the oldest of the 4 and who had the easy manner of someone who has never felt compelled to make other people's business his own, caught my eye over his soup bowl and raised it very slightly, the acknowledged question. I gave the smallest possible shake of my head. He nodded once and went back to his soup. Nobody said a word about it. After they left, the child said, "They didn't ask." "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about how to explain the code of behavior that develops in places where a lot of different kinds of people pass through, and everyone is in transit and nobody's story is quite what it appears. Because they could see it wasn't their business, I said, and they're decent people. He absorbed this. He stopped, started again. Where I come from, everyone asks. Different kind of place, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. I found out later, much later, that Corvith hatchling royals are taught the lingua franca as their third language, after their own speech and the formal draconic of the court. That he was speaking to me in it from the start, and that it was neither his first nor his second tongue, explained something about the slight formality of how he chose his words even as a small child. Precise rather than casual, the way someone speaks a language they learned in a classroom rather than in a kitchen. Every sentence he constructed was careful, not in the way of someone shy, but in the way of someone for whom language was a domain requiring precision, because imprecision, where he came from, had consequences. At the time, I just thought he was a quiet, careful child who had been frightened, and was slowly becoming less frightened. On day 4, he came out of the back room in the morning and sat up on one of the counter stools, which involved a certain amount of tail arrangement that was clearly awkward, and he watched me set out the cups and the bread rolls and the morning condiment trays, and then he said, carefully, "You work alone." "I do," I said. He considered this. "Is that hard?" I thought about it honestly. I have not always worked alone. There was a canteen in the city many years ago with a staff of 6 and a breakfast service that ran 300 covers and an owner who treated everyone like they were either a problem or a resource, never a person. There was a lunch counter at the transit hub where I worked with one other person, who was one of the best I have ever known at the physical mechanics of food service, and who could also disappear into her own head so completely that entire shifts passed without anything like actual conversation. There was a cafe near the port where I was for 2 years after my husband died, which was the kind of work you do when you are not ready to be anywhere particular, but you need your hands to be busy. "Sometimes," I said, "mostly it's just how it is." He nodded, slow and deliberate, the way children nod when they are absorbing something that seems to them more complicated than the answer given. Then he said, "I'll help." He couldn't reach the counter from the floor, not quite, but from the stool he could, and he turned out to be careful with things, attentive in a way that surprised me. He didn't drop anything. He watched how I set the cups and then set the next row the same way, handles turned outward at the same angle. I didn't ask him to do that. He just did it. The symmetry was his own idea, imposed with the quiet certainty of someone who has strong instincts about how things ought to be arranged, and enough confidence in those instincts to act on them without needing anyone's approval. I let him help. It seemed the right thing. By day 5, I had started mentally calling him the child, because I needed something to call him, and he hadn't offered anything else. He helped with the morning setup and then sat in the kitchen doorway or on his floor by the back room cot while the canteen filled and emptied with the freighter crews, watching the comings and goings with those gold-amber eyes, taking it all in. He was, I realized, an extremely effective observer. He watched without appearing to watch. There was no obvious intensity, no leaning forward, no focused stare. He simply absorbed. The crews moved through, ordered, ate, paid, left, and the child sat in the kitchen doorway and processed all of it with an efficiency that was, in retrospect, entirely characteristic of someone being educated, from a young age, to read rooms. He didn't speak to the customers. They glanced at him occasionally. Most of them, in my experience, have enough common sense not to ask pointed questions about who is sitting quietly in someone's kitchen, and the ones who don't have that sense have enough social instinct to read that this is not the moment. Nobody asked me directly. I offered nothing. He was there. He was quiet. He was clearly not a threat to anyone's soup order, and that was the beginning and the end of it for most people passing through. On day 5, he also, for the first time, came out of the back room before I was in the kitchen. I found him already in the canteen when I came through, standing at the counter looking at the cup rack, and when I came in he turned and said, matter-of-factly, "Should I start the cups?" "Please," I said. He started the cups. The handles were all at the same angle as the day before. On day 6 he said, "What is this called?" pointing at the rice dish as I set it in front of him. "I call it the rice dish," I said. He looked at me as if he had expected a more impressive answer. Then something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, quickly and carefully controlled. I got the sense he was not much accustomed to letting amusement show too readily on his face, which is a peculiar habit in a child, the kind of habit that is learned rather than natural. "The rice dish," he repeated exactly. "My mother called it something fancier," I said. "I never remember it right, so I gave up trying." He looked at his plate and then back at me. "I like it," he said. "Good," I said. There's more. On day 7, the first rumors reached the way station. It came through Darrow, who ran the fuel depot and who was my principal source of news from the broader region, because he talked to every pilot who came through, and he had a gift for assembling scattered fragments into something resembling a picture. He came by in the afternoon while the child was napping in the back room, leaned on my counter, and said, in the mild, conversational tone he used for things that were actually alarming him, "There's a search going on. Corvith Royal Fleet. 3 systems wide, apparently. You haven't heard anything." "I haven't," I said. "Nobody knows what for," he said, "or nobody's saying. The pilot off the Teth Coral Run said the search ships are stopping every freight hauler in the outer reach." He picked up a bread roll I had left out and turned it in his hands. "Something important." "Something important," I agreed carefully. He looked at me over the bread roll. Darrow is not a stupid man. He has the weathered, patient intelligence of someone who has spent 20 years watching people arrive and leave, and has gotten very good at reading the ones who are carrying something they are not saying. He looked at me for a moment with that particular quality of attention, and then he set the bread roll down and said, "All right, Mara. You want anything from the supply run tomorrow?" "Bay leaves," I said, "and the large size of the dried lentils." "Bay leaves," he said. "Done." He left. I stood at the counter for a while, not moving. I thought about the scale marking along the horn ridge. I thought about the way the child held himself on the stool, upright, measured, not quite the casual sprawl of a child at home. I thought about the third language learned in a classroom. I thought about the tight wrapping of the tail around the ankles when frightened, which I had not seen him do since the first night, because he had, somewhere in the days between, stopped being frightened. I thought about the way he set the cups with such instinctive symmetry. I thought about the word important. I went into the back room. He was awake, lying on his side on the floor with his tail loosely around his ankles, not frightened. I had come to understand, just comfortable. He looked up when I came in. "Is there something you need to tell me?" I asked. I said it gently, because he was a child and whatever had landed him at the bottom of a loading dock in the rain was clearly not a small thing, and I was not going to crowd him about it. But it seemed, given what Darrow had said, that I ought to ask. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought he was going to choose not to answer. Then he said, "I am not supposed to say." "All right," I said. "But I was not supposed to be here," he added, which was not nothing. "I went somewhere I was told not to go, and then I could not find the way back." "And there are people looking for you," I said. He met my eyes, and for a moment the careful, measured expression dropped, and I saw what was underneath it, not fear exactly, but something heavier than fear. The particular weight of a child who knows they have done something wrong and knows the people who love them are frightened for them, and who cannot reconcile the need to be found with the knowledge of what being found will mean. The mathematics of being missing, the relief you will bring to the people looking is precisely equal to the measure of how thoroughly you have frightened them, and that measure does not shrink when you come back. It converts, instead, into something else, into the aftermath. "Yes," he said, "there are people looking." I crouched down so I was at his level. My knees are not what they were at 40, and they reminded me of this, but I stayed down. "Well," I said, "you're safe here, and when you're ready we'll sort out the rest." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Why are you being kind to me?" The question surprised me, not because it was a strange question, but because it was such a plain one, asked without guile, as if he genuinely wanted to know the answer and had decided the only way to find it was to ask it directly. I thought about it. "Because you were cold and wet and lost," I said. "That seemed like enough reason." He was quiet for another moment. Then he uncurled slightly and said, "In the court there is always a reason for everything." "I imagine there is," I said. "Canteen's not the court." I got back up with some effort. "Come out when you want," I said. "There's tea." He came out. He had the tea, which he approached with the same careful intensity he brought to everything, cupping the mug in both scaled hands and breathing in the steam before drinking, as if taking inventory of the thing before committing to it. He sat on his stool and I went back to the prep for the dinner service, and we didn't talk for a while, and the silence between us had become, somewhere in the 7 days since the loading dock, a comfortable one. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The other kind. On day 8, I moved the small stool that I usually kept near the dry store's shelf in the back room out to the kitchen, because I had noticed he liked to sit where he could see both the kitchen and the canteen at once, and the counter stools were not quite as comfortable for him as they looked. He arranged himself on the back room stool with a kind of deliberate dignity that I had also noticed and liked. He was a child who took his physical arrangement in a room seriously, as if how he sat said something about him that he wanted control over. He tried the stool twice, shifted slightly on the first try, resettled on the second, and then was still. And from the quality of that stillness, I could tell that he had gotten it right by his own measure. There was something about the mornings that I had come to notice and did not comment on. He was always awake before me, not waiting in the back room, not sitting on his floor with his tail wound around his ankles, actually awake, alert, turned toward the door, as if sleep for him was a thing you ended rather than a thing that ended you. I had a habit in the years of working alone of arriving in the kitchen at a certain pace, not rushed, not slow, and the presence of another person in the space, or near it, had not disrupted that pace. He had slotted into it somehow, without making me conscious of the slot. By day 6, I had started making his tea at the same time as mine without deciding to. By day 8, I had made it twice in the same morning without realizing, set 2 cups out before I had fully woken up, as if the arithmetic of the kitchen had simply included him. I noticed it when I put the second cup down and looked at it. He came out of the back room a moment later and sat on the stool, and I said, "Tea," and he said, "Thank you," and picked it up in both hands, and we did not discuss the 2 cups. On day 8, he also, for the first time, asked me about my work history. Not the canteen specifically, the history behind it. He asked the way he asked most things, directly, without preamble, with the clear intention of listening to the whole answer rather than just the first few sentences. So I told him, the city canteen, the transit hub, the cafe by the port. The years in the agri-settlement kitchen on the outer colony rim that I don't talk about often, but that were, in their way, the most clarifying period of my professional life, because there is nothing like feeding 100 people who would otherwise have inadequate food to teach you why the work actually matters. He listened to all of it. He asked one question at the end: "What made you come to Karath?" And I told him that too, that I had been looking for somewhere quiet enough that I could hear myself think, and that Karath had turned out to be exactly that, and that quiet enough and exactly that were not phrases I had expected to apply to the same place, but that was how it had gone. He thought about this for a while. Then he said, "I think that is a good reason to go somewhere." "It served," I said. He nodded slowly. "I went somewhere for a bad reason," he said. It was the most he had said about it since the first night. He said it plainly, not seeking absolution, just naming the fact. "What happened?" I asked just as plainly. "I wanted to see something I had been told I could not see," he said. "A place outside the reach, outside the—" he paused. "Outside where I am supposed to be." He looked at his hands, the scaled surfaces of them, the small sharp points at the fingertips that were still blunted with youth. I knew where it was. I had studied the charts. I thought I could go and come back and it would not matter. A pause. It mattered. "Most things do," I said. "When you're young, that's the surprise. When you're older, it's just what you expect." He looked up at me. "Does it become easier, knowing that things will matter?" "Not exactly easier," I said. "Just less surprising, which is something." He considered this with the grave attention he gave to anything that seemed to him to be actual information rather than pleasantry. Then he said, "My tutor would say that is a good lesson." Your tutor sounds sensible, I said. My tutor is very sensible, he said, in a tone that was as close as he had yet come to dry humor. It is occasionally inconvenient. I went back to the prep. He sat on his stool and watched the kitchen, and after a while he said, Mara. Yes. Thank you, he said, for not asking. I didn't answer immediately. I was slicing bread and the knife wanted attention. Then I said, You'll tell me what you want to tell me when you want to tell me. That's generally how it works in a canteen. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a rule? More of an operating principle, I said. He seemed to find this satisfactory. On day 9, he asked me about the bleach spot on my apron. I told him about the cleaning product incident with the shelf unit 2 years ago that had stripped the green out of a fist-sized section of the fabric. He listened with complete attention, as if the exact chemistry of apron discoloration was a matter of genuine interest to him, and then he said gravely, It gives it character. I looked at him over the prep counter. Something in his expression told me he had not expected to find that quite as funny as he did, but that he was finding it funny. The controlled amusement again, more visible this time, the edges of it showing. You know, I said, you don't have to keep the lid on everything all the time. He looked at me. You're in a canteen, I said. In the back room, nobody's watching. He thought about this. Then, quietly, he allowed the amusement to reach his face properly, and the effect of it was startling, not because there was anything alarming about a small dragon smiling, but because it transformed his entire aspect, dropped 10 years of gravity off his expression, and made him look exactly as young as he was. He had a good smile. Unpracticed, a little awkward with the newness of using it without restraint, but real. The kind of smile that has not yet learned to manage itself. The rice dish, he said, for no reason I could identify, except that it seemed to have become, in the 9 days, a kind of shorthand between us for something that didn't need spelling out. The rice dish, I agreed. I put a plate of it in front of him. There was some left from the service, and he ate it in the good way he had developed, unhurried, genuinely tasting it rather than just consuming it, and the smile was still there at the edges of his expression the whole time, softer now but persistent, like something that had been let out and was not sure about going back in. I did not point it out. Some things are better left unremarked. On day 10, the search fleet arrived in the outer reach. Darrow told me in the morning, not casually this time. He came in early before the first customers and stood at the counter and said, Corvith Royal Guard, Mara. 6 ships confirmed in the outer reach corridor. Pilots coming in from the Vel Station run are saying the search command is stopping and boarding anything that moves. He watched my face. They haven't come to Kareth yet, but they will. I was stirring the stock. All right, I said. Is there anything you want to tell me? He asked, which was Darrow being direct, which he almost never was. I set the spoon down. I thought about 11 days on a folding stool. I thought about a small, careful child learning when it was safe to smile. I thought about, why are you being kind to me? And in the court there is always a reason. And I went somewhere for a bad reason. And a note about a longer cloth to reach the back corner of the warming shelf and 2 amber eyes watching me work in the early morning light when he thought I hadn't noticed yet. His name, I said, is Velthan. That's all I know. Darrow's face went through a sequence of expressions that took less than 2 seconds but contained what appeared to be a significant amount of internal reckoning. Then he said, very quietly, Mara. I know, I said. They're going to come here. I know that too. He picked up his mug and put it down and picked it up again. What do you want to do? Feed people their breakfast, I said. And then wait. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and left. I went into the back room. The child was awake, sitting on his floor space with his tail loosely curled, watching the door in that way he had, not anxious, not eager, just attentive. as if the world was a thing he preferred to observe before engaging with it. I sat down on the cot. It creaked. My knees made their own complaint. "The search fleet is in the outer reach," I said. "The Royal Guard." He was very still. "They'll probably be here tomorrow or the day after," I said. "Maybe sooner." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry for what this will cause you." "It won't cause me anything," I said, which I genuinely believed and which turned out to be approximately wrong in all the ways that matter. "You were cold and wet and lost. I gave you soup and a dry floor to sleep on. That's not something anyone needs to be sorry for." He looked at me steadily, and something in his expression was doing something complicated that I did not entirely know how to read. "My mother," he said carefully, "will want to know who kept me." "I'm Mara Osei," I said. "I run the canteen. That's all she needs to know." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think," he said at last, "that she will find it quite that simple." I didn't have a good answer to that, so I said, "Come have breakfast," and went back out to the kitchen. He followed me out and sat on his stool, and I put the rice dish in front of him, because we had a good amount left from the day before and it reheated well, and he ate it the good way and we didn't talk much. And when the first customers came in at 6:30, he watched them the way he always did, taking his inventory of the room. It was an ordinary morning, the way mornings at Carath were generally ordinary. The light came in pale and clear through the front window, the stock simmered, the bread rolls warmed, the crews came in for their coffee and their sandwiches and went out again. On day 10 in the afternoon, between the lunch service and the dinner prep, he came out of the back room to where I was sitting at the counter doing my ordering, and he said, "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead," I said. "What will happen to the canteen?" he said, "after?" I looked up from the ordering sheet. He was standing at the near end of the counter with his arms at his sides, not fidgeting, just standing in the serious, considered way he did most things. "Nothing will happen to the canteen," I said. "It'll go on being a canteen." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to be sure," he said. Then he went back to the back room, and that was the end of it. I sat with the ordering sheet for a while longer without writing anything on it. There was something in the question that stayed with me, not the concern it expressed, which was plain enough, but the form it took. He had asked about the canteen, not about me. The instinct of someone who had learned or been taught to frame worry in terms of the institution rather than the person, because worrying about the person too directly was a form of acknowledging that the person mattered in a way that might complicate things. It was a sideways question. The direct version would have been, "Will you be all right?" He had not been able to ask that one. He had asked the closest question that preserved the composure. I wrote "bay leaves double" on the ordering sheet and went back to the prep. Later, about an hour before the dinner service, he came out again and sat on his stool and watched me work, and after a while he said, without preamble, "I have not stayed anywhere this long, without arrangements." I was chopping onions, which is their own kind of occasion for silence, but I paid attention. "Without people knowing where I was," he said, "or what I needed," or he stopped, considered. "Without a schedule," he settled on. "I have always had a schedule." And I said. He thought about it for a moment. "It is very quiet," he said, "the not having one." "Good quiet or bad quiet?" Another pause. I had learned in the 10 days that his pauses meant something, not uncertainty, but the same care with language he brought to everything. The precision of a third language speaker, making sure the word earned its place. "I think," he said, "I did not know that kind existed." I finished the onions. I put the knife down and looked at him, and he met my eyes with that steady amber attention, waiting to see if there was a response coming. "It does," I said. "It takes some practice to recognize it." He nodded once slowly. Then he said, "I will try to remember that." "Good," I said. "Now hand me the garlic." He handed me the garlic, 2 cloves of it, without asking why or pausing to evaluate the request, and we went on with the dinner prep. The stock simmered. The afternoon light sat flat and steady on the repair yard through the front window. Outside I could see Darrow at the fuel depot door, talking to someone from the morning's second run, gesturing toward the landing strip with the easy proprietary sweep of a man who has overseen a specific patch of ground for long enough to feel entitled to gesture at it. I thought about a small dragon in the rain, with a tail wrapped around his own ankles. I wrote bay leaves double on the ordering sheet and went back to the prep. Day 11. I had just opened up, the first cup set out and the stock on for the morning, when Darrow came in at a half run, which I had never seen him do in 7 years, and said, "They're on the ground," and I came around the counter and went to the door and looked out. They had landed in the repair yard, which was the only surface at Carath large enough for what they had brought. 6 ships, as reported, and they were unlike the freighters and cargo haulers that used Carath's strip. They were not large in an industrial way. They were large in a different way, a way that had nothing to do with carrying capacity and everything to do with authority. The hulls were dark, scaled patterned in the way that draconic military craft sometimes were, each surface ridge intentional, carved looking, the whole form of each ship suggesting not something built but something grown. The boarding ramps that came down as I watched were the wide, graduated kind designed for large draconic frames. The crew that came down the ramps was not what I had expected, and what I had expected had already been more than I was accustomed to dealing with at Carath Way Station before 7 in the morning. They were in what I can only describe as formal military arrangement, not combat formation, the way a unit expecting trouble would move, but the slow, measured step of a procession. 6 of them flanked the ramp of the lead ship, 3 on each side, their scales deep red and dark violet and one a pale silver that caught the early light differently from the others. They were big, not hatchling-sized, not even close. The pale silver one had a span that, when it moved, caught the morning air under its partly extended wings, and I heard the sound of it from the canteen doorway. A low, deep displacement of air that I felt more than heard. They moved with the kind of deliberate quiet that very large things sometimes achieve, not silence born of stealth, but the natural silence of creatures for whom rapid movement is optional, because nothing in the surrounding environment presents any reasonable threat. Behind them, down the center of the ramp, came the Queen. I knew she was the Queen the same way you know a thing without having been explicitly told it. Something in how the others oriented around her, the particular quality of the space they gave her, the way every head in the approaching group angled incrementally toward her without appearing to consciously do so. She was tall, taller than any dragon I had seen come through Carath in 7 years, and her scales were the deep, luminous violet of deep-water things, carrying the faint iridescence of oil on water in certain lights. Her horns were long and curved backward, and the tips of them were sharp and darkened, the bone-hard points of full maturity, carrying the weight of real age. She moved with the kind of deliberate calm that is the other side of grief, the composure that exists because the alternative is something too large for a public setting. Each step was even, unhurried, precise. A procession, not a search. She was looking at the canteen. I stood in my doorway with my green apron, with the bleach spot on the left hip, and I looked back. From behind me, from the kitchen, came the sound of the small stool being pushed back on the floor tiles. Then smaller footsteps. Then a small scaled body appeared at my side, and the child stood at the door with me and looked out at the ships and the procession and the Queen. He said something in Draconic, I don't know what. The tone of it was the thing, the pitch of a child's voice carrying something that was not quite a sob and not quite a call, something between, the sound of 11 days of held back coming unlocked at once. Not loud, not a cry, just the specific frequency of a young creature who has been very far from home for a very long time and has just, at this moment with this sound, admitted it to itself. The Queen stopped walking. Then she came forward, faster now, the careful procession dissolving behind her, and she came to the door of my canteen, and the child went down the step and into her, and she folded down to him and around him in the way of large creatures going small for the things they love, wings partly extended and then drawn in, tail curving, the whole great frame compressing to match his size, as naturally as a tide coming in. She was saying something in the draconic, quiet and continuous, and he was saying something back, and whatever was between them in those words was not my business, and I did not try to make it mine. I stepped back into the canteen. I don't know how long they were there. I went behind the counter and I put the kettle on again, because it seemed the right thing to do, and because I needed something to do with my hands. Darrow had come in and was sitting at the far end of the counter not saying anything, which was good of him. Good of him to come in, and good of him not to say anything. He poured himself a cup from the pot I had made at opening, and he sat with it and looked at the surface of the counter, and that was how we waited. After a while there were footsteps at the door. The Queen came in. She was large in my canteen. Not uncomfortably so, not in a way that suggested she was a poor fit for the space, but large in the way that reminded you of the size of the space you had previously thought of as adequate. The ceiling cleared her horns, but not by the kind of margin that you stop thinking about after the first moment. She moved to the counter and stopped, and her eyes were the same amber gold as the child's but older, the gold deeper and the amber more settled, and whatever had been compressed behind the composure had shifted slightly, not dissolved, but altered by relief. The way a thing that has been held under great tension eases when the pressure source is removed, not immediately slack, but differently taut. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in lingua franca so clean and precise it sounded like something practiced over centuries of use, "You kept him." "He needed keeping," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "For 11 days, she said. 11 days, I agreed. He helped with the setup, he's careful with the cups." Something moved across her face that I did not have the vocabulary for. Then she said, "He told me your name." "Mara Osei," I said. "I run the canteen." "Yes," she said. She said it in a way that suggested she knew this and also knew something else beside it. "He told me what you said to him, about why you were kind." She paused. "Because he was cold and wet and lost. That seemed like enough reason." I had not known he was going to remember that verbatim. I didn't know what to do with the fact that he had. "It was enough reason," I said. "It's still enough reason." She looked at me for a long time. Outside, through the canteen's single front window, I could see the procession standing at ease in the repair yard, and the child among them, standing very straight in the way I had seen him stand when he was taking his physical arrangement in a room seriously. He was talking to one of the silver-scaled royal guard, and the guard was listening with a degree of attention that was, even from this distance, visible. Not the polite attention of a sentry performing courtesy. Actual attention, the kind you give to someone who is telling you something worth hearing. "Kethsana," the Queen said. I had not heard the word before. I didn't know then what it meant. She said it the way you say a name that has been carefully chosen, not quickly, not casually. The way you say something that is intended to last. The same deliberate weight the child had put behind every word he chose, but magnified, carrying the authority of something much older and much larger than a child on a canteen stool. "In the tongue of the Corvith court," she said, "there is a phrase, old tongue older than the reach itself. It means," she paused, not because she didn't know the translation, but because she was choosing the right one. She who kept the small fire from going out. I looked at her. "My son," she said, "had not smiled in public since he was 4 years old. My court reports this. His tutors, his household, he has been careful, guarded, trained to it. The weight of what he will one day carry." She looked at the cup in front of me, the one I had set out on reflex for whoever came to the counter, and which she had not touched. "He came home this morning and he told me about the bleach spot on your apron," she said. He told me it gave it character. Something tightened in my chest. I didn't show it. I have been running a canteen for 22 years and you learn to hold things. He did, I confirmed. He laughed when he said it, she said. He laughed, Mara Osai, in front of me. She stopped, composed herself, without calculating whether he should. I didn't have anything to say to that. I kept quiet and let the moment be what it was. Kethsana, she said again, it is not a title of the court. It cannot be bought or granted through rank or service record. It is only ever given. She looked at me steadily. By the queen of the Corvith line to someone who has done the thing it describes. In the 300 years of the current line, it has been given 4 times. Outside, the child, Velthin, was still talking to the silver-scaled guard, and from the animation of the guard's response, whatever was being said was going well. I just fed him soup, I said. Yes, she said, and you let him help with the cups, and you sat on a creaking cot in your storeroom and told him he didn't need a reason and he didn't need to apologize. She held my gaze. You told him the canteen was not the court. I had not realized how precisely he had been listening. The canteen is not the court, I said. He needed somewhere that wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he did, yes, a pause. He will need to know how to find his way back to that, later, when the weight is fully his. I understood then what she was saying, and I didn't argue with it, because arguing would have been foolish. What she was saying was true. The child I had known for 11 days, the one who had learned to let the amusement reach his face, who had called the rice dish in the tone of something that had become a small private language between us, who had held the step stool because it was a practical contribution honestly rendered. That child was going to go back to the court and put the composure back on because it was what he would need. And that was right. That was the appropriate thing. The weight he would carry one day was not a small weight, and you do not carry a not small weight without some kind of container for it. The composure was the container. It had to go back on. But he had had 11 days without it, and apparently that mattered. Kethsana, the queen said a third time. The third time felt different from the first 2, settled, completed, like a knot tied off properly at the end. The name is yours, Mara Osai. It will be recorded in the lineage of the Corvith court. It will be known. I looked at her. I looked at my canteen, the 3 tables, the 4 counter stools, the kitchen behind the half wall, the back room door standing open where the small stool was still pushed back on the floor tiles from this morning, the folded blanket on the cot, the empty water bowl. I appreciate it, I said. I genuinely do, but I have a breakfast service to finish. She looked at me. Then something shifted in her expression, not amusement exactly, but the recognition of something she found, perhaps, unexpectedly clarifying. The kind of recognition that arrives when a thing turns out to be exactly what it appeared to be, which, in her world, apparently required recognition because it was unusual. She picked up the cup I had set out and she looked at it, and she set it down again. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. She turned toward the door. At the threshold she paused. He will want to come back, she said, without turning around. To Karath. He will find reasons, official ones, I suspect, which will have very little to do with the actual reason. I thought of the stool by the stove, the rice dish, the deliberate arrangement of the cup handles at the same angle every morning without being asked. He'll always have a stool here, I said, and there's always more rice dish if he wants it. She paused for one breath at the threshold, then she went out. Through the window, I watched her move back across the repair yard to where Velthin stood. He saw her coming and went straight, the deliberate posture, the composure sliding back into place as naturally and automatically as breathing, as if it had only ever been temporarily set aside rather than absent. The guard around him rearranged. The procession reformed. He was, once again and from the outside, entirely a prince. But before she reached him, he turned and looked back at the canteen window. He found me through the glass. I don't know how, the light was wrong for it, but he found me. And for one moment the composure went somewhere else and the face I knew was there. The one that had decided the bleach spot gave the apron character. The one that had said the rice dish, in the tone of something shared. The one that had held a step stool steady with both hands because it was a practical contribution and someone needed it done. Then he turned back and the formation closed around him, and they walked together toward the ships. I stood at the window for a moment. Then I went back behind the counter, because Darrow's cup was empty and there were 2 freighter crew coming through the door, and it was 7:15, and the bread rolls were not going to serve themselves. There is a name in the lineage of the Corvith Court, I am told. It has been there since that morning, recorded by whatever process they use for such things, in whatever medium the Corvith Court uses to hold its history. I don't know what the record says exactly. I haven't asked to see it and nobody has sent me a copy, which suits me fine. Keth Sana, she who kept the small fire from going out. It is, I think, a considerable amount of credit for 11 days of soup and a dry floor. But I have learned, in the years since, not to argue with it. The Queen named it and she knew what she was naming, and she has had 300 years of her line's history to develop a sense of what is and isn't worth a name. I trust the assessment, even if I don't entirely understand it. What I understand is this. 11 weeks after that morning, a formal freight inquiry arrived at Carath from the Corvith Outer Trade Commission, requesting a standing supply contract for dried lentils, bay leaves, and a specified quantity of long-grain rice to be delivered to a Corvith way station 3 systems inward for the use of a regional administrative post. The contract was substantial. It was, Darrow said, going to make the way station supply relationships considerably more stable for the foreseeable future. He said this with the entirely neutral expression of a man who had decided to have no opinions about certain things and was committing to that decision. I thanked him and filed the contract and put in the order. Attached to the inquiry was a note, not official. A single page, written in the careful, precise lingua franca of someone for whom it was a third language. It said, I have been trying to explain the rice dish to the kitchen staff here. They are not getting it right. I believe the problem is that they are calling it something. I told them they should call it the rice dish. Below that, I am well. I hope your knees are managing the winter. Below that, no signature. Just a small mark in the corner of the page, something between a seal and a sketch. The horns and the eye of a young dragon in the quick, unpracticed hand of someone who had not done much drawing, rendered with more care than skill but entirely, unmistakably, itself. The proportions were slightly off, one horn longer than the other, but the eye was right. The particular amber gold of it, even in ink on paper, was right. I put it on the shelf in the back room, above the folded blanket on the cot. I have meant to frame it for 2 years and I have not gotten around to it. Some things you don't have to frame to keep. The stool is still by the stove. I have not moved it. I don't plan to. The handles of the first row of cups face outward at the same angle every morning. I started doing it that way and I kept doing it. Some habits make more sense than others, and I don't spend much time sorting which is which. There is always more rice dish.